I think it's come time again for us to talk about my favorite series once more on the channel, Land of the Lustrous, otherwise known as Houseki no Kuni in Japan. A heartwarming tale about a young, naive gemstone named Phosphophyllite on their quest to find purpose in their life, and thus adventure awaits. And then episode 2 starts, and we begin the grade A certified pain train. From the loss of their legs to the loss of their only friend, our little gemstone has had it moderately rough. But, you know, on the bright side, they never did anything bad. Did they?
先生、その子は戦うんですか？
まだわからないが、優しい子だ。
A little longer than a few minutes later.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
Hello, Doomers and Doomettes, I'm your host Didi, and today we return to the Land of the Lustrous and our favorite depressed PTSD victim, Phosphophyllite. With the manga still on hiatus, and unfortunately no Season 2 in sight at the time of this recording, I wanted to contribute a bit to the current vacuum of content in the community and give some thoughts on our little gemstone while we wait for things to pick up again, and potentially start a new video series along the way, where today we'll ask the big question: did Phosphophyllite do anything wrong? Now, before we begin, I just want to establish some things, and first off, this video will contain full spoilers for the series up to chapter 95, and today we'll be evaluating their actions to determine whether or not it can be said that Phos did nothing wrong. If you haven't checked out Land of the Lustrous already, I highly recommend you do so, as it's one of my all-time favorite series, and we've covered an introduction of it already on the channel. You can check that out linked in the description below. And as always, if this is content you're interested in and you're new to the channel, then I'd just like to humbly ask for you to consider liking the video or even subscribing to the channel, as it helps me identifying what content should be made more, and I greatly appreciate all of your support. And if you're a returning subscriber, welcome back. And with that said, let's dive right in. So before we discuss the moral standings of the character, let's first take a look at their journey up to this point. Phosphophyllite was someone struggling for purpose in the world, and they had a childlike demeanor, which was something that often caused a lot of ridicule and teasing. Phos was treated as someone incapable of working, or downright told that he shouldn't even be around. Over a series of events, Phos gradually begins to lose pieces of themselves and has them replaced. Arguably, they were seen as upgrades and give them a new sense of purpose at the cost of losing who they once were. They become a better fighter, more capable to rely on. However, they struggle with the guilt of those they have lost again and again, bearing a heavy responsibility for that. But despite that, they still have their moments of expressing true joy, similar to the younger self when things are looking well. However, things start to go from bad to worse when Phos loses their head, literally. An attack from the Lunarians resulted in their decapitation, and with little options left, their partner, Cairngorm, takes the head of their old partner, Lapis Lazuli. No, not that one, and they affix their head to Phos's body. The problem with this, however, was that Lapis Lazuli and Phos had two different personalities. Lapis was highly intelligent, but someone who was cited to be more interested in talking to others for their own curiosity's sake rather than out of any desire to help, and was even referred to as a bit deceptive. Phos, however, was someone who was willing to help others at the expense of themselves. Naturally, this led to a bit of a personality change, especially as they became more and more inquisitive of Sensei, but we'll come back to that. This leads to a major turning point in the series where Phos finally makes it to the moon, where they meet Prince Acmea, leader of the Lunarians. A very secretive character with a lot going on in his own right, Acmea provides Phos with a lot of the answers to the questions they sought, that Sensei is a machine who exists to prey for the Lunarians, and his inability to function is the reason that they are attacking the Lustrous. This shatters Phos's worldview, as it provides justification for their recent suspicions and questioning nature, and it allows for an easy outlet to trust this new entity. While it may be easy for us as a reader to recognize the suspicious nature of this new character, to Phos, this is someone who provided much needed information, but we'll expand upon that in just a moment. Now, after this point, this is where Phos starts to do some morally questionable things. They return to the island and secretly convince half of them to return to the moon, after which they launch a first attack on the island in a half-baked attempt to force Sensei to pray for the Lunarians, which fails humiliatingly. Phos then attempts to go back to the island peacefully to negotiate, but because of the recent attack, Phos is restrained, shattered, and their remains are scattered and buried across the island. Which leads us to the big moment. After over 200 years of being forgotten, Phos is finally reassembled by Sensei and enters a feral state. Consumed by the desire for revenge after being abandoned for centuries, Phos launches a brutal assault on the island, grinding each gem under their heels. After all, there is no emotion more human than a thirst for revenge. So, what are the accused crimes? Manipulation, stirring up a conflict, going traitor, and launching a full-scale assault assault with the intent to crush every gem. Definitely things they did, but now we ask the big question. Did Phos do anything wrong? Let's break it down. I believe the point in the story where we can start saying things went bad is when Phos had their head replaced with that of lapis lazuli. Sure, they lost body parts before and changed as a character, but this was a point in the story where the characters recognized Phos wasn't behaving like Phos anymore. This differs from when Phos lost Antarcticite, as well as when they had their arms replaced, as that was a point where the character's personality changed as a result of trauma and circumstance. Phos begins to question Sensei's motive at that point and becomes a bit more inquisitive, but the true driving catalyst that forces them to take action is the new head, which begins to change their personality. It's at this point where we see suspicion turn into outright defiance, as Phos outright accuses Sensei of lying in front of everyone, angrily confronting them. And finally, when they go to the moon and meet Acmea, it's at this point where they start to believe that secrecy and manipulation would be the best tactics to recruit others to their cause. But hold on a second, let's briefly talk about Prince Acmea. You may question why Phos would have any reason to trust this man, as after all, he's been responsible for all of the abductions and the loss of all their friends at this point. Clearly, he has an ulterior motive, so how could Phos be suddenly much more intelligent yet fall for someone so obvious? Well, consider things from their perspective. Phos has had strong reasons to distrust Sensei and was finally given validation for all of that distrust and was given proof that he was lying. Consider a time in your life where you were distrustful of someone and someone else provided proof of their deception to you. Naturally, you would feel a bit more attached to that new individual, would you not? Even if you had reason to distrust the new person later, would you not feel a slight bit more trust towards them for providing you with that confirmation bias? Prince Acmea provided Phos with the answers they were looking for, and he knew that. But Phos, although trusting of Acmea for providing them with answers, wasn't simply willing to blindly obey him. Upon their return to Earth and contemplation for the coming betrayal, Phos is only thinking that so long as the Lunarians get what they want, there will no longer be a reason for them to come and shatter the gems and take them to the moon. And Phos isn't looking to cause any harm to the other gems at this point. The reason for this betrayal stems from Sensei's perceived deception towards them. Now, we as a reader are aware that Sensei, now revealed to have the name Kongo, isn't intending to deceive by choice, but rather, as a machine, he has limitations on what he is able to talk about. But to Phos, Sensei was the only authority figure in their entire existence, and now was revealed to be hiding some pretty substantial secrets. What do you think that would do to a person? To anyone? The betrayal of the gems isn't intended to start a civil war. To Phos, they see this as an attempt to rescue them from a being who has been deceiving them in an attempt to free them and bring an end to this millennia of conflict. It's clearly established that the reason Phos then works the way they do to cause a betrayal is because they're not capable of simply telling the truth to them. If Phos returned from the moon only to start rambling that their beloved Sensei is a robot designed to prey, the rest of the gems would consider Phos insane. Just look at how intolerant Bort is for proof of that. But at the same time, Phos even recognizes that their attempts to prey on the weaknesses of other gems is rotten, but it's seen as the only option to bring them to the moon. This would probably lead on to what I would say is the thing that Phos does wrong, specifically targeting the weaknesses of the other gems. While the motive is understandable, and while Phos even recognizes that this is manipulative, it still causes some serious damages that could have been avoided. Most notably, in my opinion, the worst action is the betrayal of Rutile. Now, Rutile I find to be an important character, as they're one of the very few gems on the island who understand Phos. Their relationship may not have been as close a friendship as, say, Antarcticite, but Rutile genuinely cares for Phos and was clearly in deep worry over their physical and mental state. But Phos attempted to force Rutile to go to the moon by taking the thing most important to them, Padparadscha, their partner. Now, Padparadscha suffers from a condition where they are unable to stay conscious for extended periods of time due to missing portions in their chest. And this is something that Rutile has spent countless years working towards. Just as Phos laments the loss of their partners like Antarcticite, Padparadscha holds that level of importance to Rutile. By kidnapping them in an attempt to bring Rutile to the moon, Rutile was left without the person that they devoted their life towards saving, giving them every reason to want Phos grounded into powder. Phosphophyllite didn't just betray Sensei, they betrayed Rutile. However, aside from that moment, I'd argue in every other instance going forward that Phos is a victim of circumstance and is constantly put into situations as a result of the manipulations of others. Consider the other moment, often cited as a mistake, their first attack against the island residents. Prior to arriving, Phos made it very clear that the target to pursue was Sensei, which makes sense due to those feelings of betrayal, and especially after Prince Acmea makes the claim to the group that they are essentially forced to love him. In addition, Padparadscha makes the suggestion, which Phos agrees to only take a small group of 3, being themselves, Phos, and Yellow Diamond so as to not let the island gems think that they've turned on them as well. So why does this attempt to force Sensei to pray go so bad? What happened to cause things to become their own civil war in a sense, and a feeling of one group versus the other? Well, I think the blame can be placed partially on one individual for that. Bort.
Bort? Oh, come on, Bort?
Hear me out. Immediately after Phos betrayed Sensei and left with the faction returning to the moon, Sensei approached the remaining gems on the island, and he opens up to them. He tells them that no one did anything wrong and attempts to take blame for everything, admitting that at the very least the only thing the Lunarians want is him. Sensei asks them to leave him and even says that joining Phosphophyllite is okay. He harbors no ill feelings towards it, and before anyone can say anything next, Bort opens their mouth. They condemn Phos as deceitful, a coward, and most importantly, not one of them. In doing so, Bort's typical aggressive behavior has now drawn a very clear line in the sand of us versus them. Whereas characters like Euclase would rather attempt to broker peace, Bort is cultivating a culture where Phos is clearly defined as the enemy, something that Sensei clearly was trying to avoid betraying them as. And considering how Bort is the strongest gem on the island, their opinion clearly has a strong pull as well, especially to the younger ones. This goes even further when Phos returns to the island alone in an attempt to negotiate for peace, where they are shattered by Bort and Cinnabar, who has now gone along with Bort's groupthink. While it's understandable to break Phos when they immediately arrive considering the previous attack, it's the next scene which is far more questionable. When Sensei attempts to pray but fails, Phos tries to reach out to him, begging him with a single word, please, before being completely shattered to pieces by every gem in the room, aside from Jade and Euclase. When Euclase says that they want to negotiate, Bort is the one to shut down that idea, saying that Phos is too manipulative. While it is true that Phos used deceptive tactics, Sensei already absolved them of their blame earlier, and even encouraged the gems to work with them. To Sensei, the center of all of this, Phos was forgiven, and he did not think of them any less, and even wondered if they were correct. And despite this, Bort, in their arrogance and their fight-first mentality, continues to reinforce conflict by standing firm that there are now two factions, the Earth and the Moon. It's from here that the Earth gems decide to hide Phos's shattered remains across the island in an agreement that they'll bring Phos back once they decide it's best. But what happens? They forgot. If Sensei didn't put Phos back together after 200 years, Phos would never have returned at all. So, consider Phos's full story up to this point. They discover that the only figure of authority they've known their entire life has been hiding massive secrets and felt betrayed. They attempt to lure their comrades away from this environment, and after a confrontation gone wrong, Phos attempts to negotiate for peace. And because of Bort convincing the Earth gems of the divide between Phos's group and themselves, factions were drawn and Phos became the enemy, despite Sensei's prior statements. And then, because of this, Phos is buried in the ground, forgotten for 220 years. It's that incident which cultivated the thirst for revenge, and it's what turned someone who was looking for a negotiative discussion into a monster. But there's one last thing at play here, one final piece to the puzzle that's far more influential than Bort's actions. The one manipulating every single event behind the scenes, moving everyone around like chess pieces. It brings us to the puppet master himself, Prince Acmea. While Bort may have led some actions in the short term to cause issue, Acmea designed the game himself. As he puts it, a single win is nothing compared to controlling the entire field. Now, this video is already rather long by my standards, so I'll attempt to keep this brief as I think I can make an entire video just analyzing Prince Acmea as a character. But basically, Acmea targeted Phos before Phos had any idea what was going on in their most pure and innocent state. Acmea saw a gem, one with a need for validation and a weakness preventing them from obtaining it, and he took advantage of it. Acmea designed scenarios for Phos to replace parts of their body, lose their friends, and losing who they are. He forced them to be isolated and alone, and ultimately, by his admission, it was he who designed it to be that Phos would lose their head, thus forcing the Lustrous to replace it with the head of Lapis Lazuli. While one might say that Phos was foolish for falling victim to Acmea's manipulations, how can you possibly begin to avoid traps set by someone when you aren't even aware of their existence? Essentially, Phos was losing chess pieces without even knowing a game was in place. And all of this was to put Phos in a situation where they would be able to replace Sensei as the next prayer machine for the Lunarians. So, can you really blame Phos for these actions when they were essentially being used as a pawn by a greater power beyond them? All of those actions actions of manipulation done with the head of lapis lazuli, can you really blame Phos when those actions were forced onto them before they had any idea what was going on? Phos had spent centuries being a pawn of someone they had no idea even existed, and once they found out of Prince Acmea, he further took advantage of them by preying on their suspicions. Who is at fault here? The person who made a poor choice, or the person forcing them into those situations by design? And thus, that brings us to answer our big question. Did Phosphophyllite do anything wrong? Ultimately, aside from the instance with betraying Rutile, I honestly can't feel like they did. When I see Phos, I see a deeply tragic character who is a victim to the circumstances around them. I see someone deeply hurt by those using them as a tool, and those completely uncaring of their plight. And I can relate pretty hard to that. I understand them. I wouldn't want them to destroy everyone, but I can see how they would end up that way. Years of trying and failing and being told that you're never going to be good enough. And when you try your best to try to bring peace to things, you're buried in the ground and forgotten. That's enough to drive anyone to a feeling of vengeance. Phos was the only gem who was working towards peace with the Lunarians. Phos was the only gem who was seriously working towards bringing the others back. And what happened? They were punished for it. But now, where does that leave us in the story? It's a bit hard to say at the moment. With Phos being the only gem left on Earth, and everyone else being reformatted into Lunarians on the moon, there's a lot of different ways things can go. If you ask me, I think next we're finally going to meet Sensei's brother in person, and I also have a suspicion that life on the moon as Lunarians isn't going to be as pleasant as they may think. However, one thing is for sure that I often lament on during this dry 10,000 year hiatus. I may say that Phosphophyllite did nothing wrong, and I do place most of the blame on Prince Acmea, but do you know what the thing is I fault him for most? Because of him, we lost the purity and innocence that was young Phos, and that's something that can never come back. Through his manipulations, he took an innocent person seeking validation and turned them into a monster. And because of him and his manipulations, Phos can never return to what they once had.
バッチリかわいい凛々しい
根拠なく明るい予感に甘えられてたのが不思議で。失礼します。あの頃の自分が羨ましい。
Hey everyone, if you stuck around to the end, thank you so much for watching. This is a topic I'm really passionate about, so I put quite a bit of work into the script for this one. Would you say that Phosphophyllite did nothing wrong? How many times would you bash Cairngorm with a hammer until you felt satisfied? Let me know in the comments. I'm not sure when the next Land of the Lustrous video I'll make will come out, but the next one will very likely be on Prince Acmea, as I think there's a lot to talk about with his character. If you have any suggestions for that, or any future Did Nothing Wrong videos, feel free to let me know. And if you haven't already, be sure to join the Discord if you'd like to chat personally. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.